Welcome to the Forged by Trust podcast. I'm your host, Robin Dreeke, former U.S. Marine, spy recruiter, best-selling author, and trust expert. This episode of the Forged by Trust podcast is brought to you by my free Keys to Communication course. Each of us craves psychological comfort, healthy relationships, and being valued by others. But most of us struggle with the communication skills we need to provide those gifts to others. Therefore, I created this 40-minute free course to provide you the 4 pillars to great communication you need to start your journey to forging trust for every aspect of your life, both personal and professional. Coming up next on the Forged by Trust podcast.
And he turns around and comes back, and he crouches down, puts his hand on one shoulder, ruffles my hair, puts the other hand on my shoulder, and he says, "I'm going to go now. You're the men of the house now." So right there, my childhood is gone. This is a fraction of a fractal of something. So is there more? I don't know how there couldn't be. And then I realized through this work that behavior is driven by beliefs, but beliefs are driven by identity. People will not do things that is in conflict with their identity. We try to do all this smart, intelligent, logical stuff. It doesn't work. Human beings are emotional first, not second, first.
Welcome to the show. I'm Robin Dreeke, and on the Forged by Trust podcast, we decode the interpersonal communication skills of the world's most acclaimed forgers of trust. We unlock the skills and techniques from spies, spy recruiters, master interrogators, globally recognized behavioral experts, C-suite executives, entrepreneurs, acclaimed authors, and thought leaders. Each episode provides specific actions that you can immediately apply to any aspect of your personal or professional life. Today's episode, our emotional source code, is with a close friend, mentor, and guide, a world-acclaimed and best-selling author, Dov Baron. Dov Baron has been named twice to the list of world's top 30 global leadership gurus and Inc. magazine's top 100 leadership speakers. He has presented to companies and organizations around the world, including the United Nations, the Department of State, the World Management Forum in Iran, the U.S. Air Force, and the famed Servant Leadership Institute. Dov's focus on human behavior and neuroscience has made him the leading authority on emotional source code and the anatomy of meaning. More about those things at www.dovbaron.com. Dov is also the best-selling author of One Red Thread and Fiercely Loyal, How High-Performing Companies Develop and Retain Top Talent. During today's episode, we talk about 3 igniters of curiosity, what more is there beyond this life, Vladimir Putin and the emotional source code, and so much more.
Good morning, sir.
Friend, mentor, guide, brother, how are you?
Well, that's very kind, mate. I'm good, mate. How are you?
I'm fantastic. I've been so looking forward to this just because I have so many, as every day passes and you anticipate a great conversation, more questions enter your mind. And so with that, I love that you have to stay curious right there, because that's one of the areas I want to dive deeper on. You know, we're calling the episode, obviously, our emotional source code, because that is your latest. And it's so easy to see how everything you do flows into that.
Yeah.
And so talking about the flow, I love, as you know, backstories. And so if we could start there, because I would love to try to understand Dov today and how it all originated and where that curiosity came from, because it's an amazing area of the human existence that you tapped into really early. It's definitely a resounding overtone of the most successful people in the world are the ones that are curious, and also the most beloved. So Dov, start us out. Where'd you grow up and what was that like for you?
I grew up in northern England. That's where I was born, surrounded by addiction, violence, crime, all the lovely stuff that happens in a ghetto.
Addiction at home or addiction around?
Addiction at home and around me.
Okay.
So addiction at home and around me. My father left when I was 7, left my mom and me and my siblings. My mom was severely depressed. I think she was depressed before my father left, but my father didn't help with that. You know, using my mom as a punching bag doesn't usually bring people's spirits up. So he left when I was 7. My mom worked multiple jobs to try and keep food on the table and electricity. I can remember feeding the electric meter because there was no power. Back in those days, you put a coin in and trying to scramble to find a penny. It was a penny to put into the electric meter. So I grew up around all those kinds of things. And my dad left, as I said, when I was 7, and he kneeled down. I came down the stairs and I could see the hallway and the light at the end of the hallway to the street. And my father's silhouette was blocking the light. My father was over 6 feet, and he was a big lad. And I'm this little boy, 7, come down the stairs, and I see my dad, and I go, Dad, Dad! I could feel the panic. And he turns around and comes back, and he crouches down, puts his hand on one shoulder, ruffles my hair, puts the other hand on my shoulder. It's interesting, because it's almost like he's knighting me. And he says, I'm going to go now. You're the men of the house now. So right there, my childhood is gone. I've now got this massive weight as a 7-year-old on how I'm supposed to be an adult. I got to go back in, turn around, go back inside, take care of my depressed mother and of my siblings who are all younger than me. So that was the place of birth, and really the end of my childhood was at that point. Later on came stepfathers and all kinds of complications.
Did you feel fearful at that point?
Oh, terrified.
What did you do?
It was completely overwhelming. I now know, because of all the therapy and work that I've done on myself, that that was the birth of anxiety.
Right.
But it was also the birth of bravado. So I couldn't afford to look anxious or upset. My mom was constantly that, so I needed to take care of her. I couldn't let my younger siblings know that the ship was sinking, so I had to look like I had it all together in a bag of chips. But the truth was, I was terrified. I said to my mother in the last few years before she died, I sat with her and said, do you know that I was terrified most of my childhood? And she goes, well, all kids get scared. I go, excuse me? That's not true, number one. And number two, I didn't say scared. I said terrified.
Right.
Terrified. I was terrified a lot of time. And people go, well, you're so confident now. Yeah, that's a journey. That's not, oh, I was born with that in my DNA. I was terrified.
What was the next step? Like, how did you survive, psychologically?
Well, it's fascinating because my dad had a brother who was close to us, Steve, close to us for about another, and he stuck around for maybe a couple of months afterwards, not much, because it was his big brother, my dad, and
right.
He was afraid of him. But my uncle came over and he would see me punching my knees, like
right.
literally punching my knees. And he'd say, why are you doing that? And I go, I'm in pain. And I still, to this day, stress shows up in my knees. And my wife will see me pump on them, and it's just to get the blood flow in there.
Right.
And that was stress in my body.
Right. Stress
in my body at 7 years old and just trying to get it to move.
Right.
And I felt no relief from that stress until maybe initially my mom had a boyfriend / stepdad for me who didn't last very long. And then another one came along, and it was wonderful because we were so poor. I mean, we didn't have food.
Right.
Right. There was no food. There was no soap. There was no money for the electric meter. We tied newspapers in knots to make a fire in the winter.
Yep.
So, it was very, very poor. And then suddenly my mom met this guy. So now she's got 4 kids. She meets this guy who seems like Prince Charming. He's, he brings my mom Chanel blouses and flowers and brings home chests full of food, and so we're eating. I mean, it's like, oh my God. And he's the white knight. I mean, he loves my mom. He's telling her she's beautiful. She's never had that. My father used to just knuckle her and tell her she was stupid and ugly. And now we're eating, and everybody's like, oh my God, what a wonderful man. Well, guess what? He was a pedophile, and he was running a pedophile ring. So of course he was a good guy for taking on a family with 4 kids.
Right.
Worked out well for him and his mates. So, so there was then that stress on top of all that, on top of everything else. And he was an alcoholic, pedophile, sex addict. So you put all that together, and he was a very functional alcoholic, but he was still an alcoholic. And, my mom was certainly not going to get rid of him. She knew what was, I believe, my sister and I believe she knew what was going on, but she was not going to get rid of him. How could she? She was working 3 jobs and we were starving to death. So she put up with it.
Any idea what kind of trauma your mother experienced in her life to have to make the choices that she wound up making?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know that this is my entire background is the understanding of the psychology of what
Right.
builds a human being.
Of course.
And I had a conversation with my mom before she died, and we were sitting there pretty close to the end, and she said, I just swapped out one asshole for another. My mother was born as the first child of her mother and father. Her father didn't want kids, shipped her off to her grandparents, and she spent like a couple of years with them from being a baby.
Mm-hmm.
And then they brought her back briefly, shipped her back to her grandparents, and this went on backwards and forwards. And her grandfather said to her, your father will want you back when you're old enough to work. And at 14, she was old enough to work because that's the age it was at that time in the UK. And at 14, he came and collected her and put her to work as a sewing machinist. He was a very abusive. My grandfather was I used to say about my stepfather is that he could cut you to the bone and walk away laughing. Like he was mean and cruel and had been violent to my grandmother and to her. So she, like she said, she just traded out what was familiar. That was part of her emotional source code. And we are dramatically pulled towards whatever's in our emotional source code until we can identify that code. Yeah. And then we have to identify what is the anatomy of meaning. And on top of that, what is the identity I've built on that keeps pulling me back into the loop.
So that was the origin. How did you pull yourself out of that? Because that stifles curiosity, that stifles growth and development. At what point did you realize you need to do something different?
It's not a moment, it's several things. So first of all, we were camping with my stepfather in Wales before things went too crazy. And I sat up in the tent, fast asleep, in what appeared to be a / waking dream nightmare.
And age was?
Almost eight. Almost
okay.
eight. Almost eight. And I started speaking in a language that was completely unfamiliar. So they figured I was babbling, right? And in the morning, my mom asked me how I was feeling. I was okay. And she goes, do you remember your dream? And I said, oh, I think so. And she said, do you know what you were saying? And I said, no, I just know it was hoppy. And she said, what's hoppy? And I said, I don't know. And later on, I came to realize that I believe, it's not the truth, I believe that I was speaking some Hopi dialect of the Native American. So somewhere I was sort of channeling something. And my mother was freaked the hell out, and that got her worried. But on top of that, as I got a little bit older, I was an artist, and my art was in galleries by the time I was a kid.
Right.
But she would say to her friends, this was part of her, when you have people who are very damaged, narcissism shows up in different forms. And so narcissism means when you have a narcissistic parent, the child is not a separate person. It's an appendage to the parent. So if I have a gift, it's my mother's gift to show off.
Right.
That's one of the signs of a narcissistic parent. So my mom would say, sit down, let our dove draw you. Our dove, that was the term, right? Let our dove draw you. And they'd be like, what? And she'd go, oh, he's really good, So they'd sit down and I'd begin to draw them. And they'd say, let me see it, because it was taking a long time. So I'd show it to them halfway done. They're like, oh, my God, you're really good. And I go, it's not finished. So they'd sit down, and then so the halfway mark they liked because it looked like them. But by the time it was fully finished, remember, these are my stepfather's friends.
Right.
It didn't look so great because my language, I drew your soul. So I draw these very dark individuals.
Right.
And at that point, my stepfather and my mother were like, I think he's possessed, and we're shipping you off to the rabbis. So I went to Lubavitch and went to the rabbis. And fortunately, I was with some really wonderful spiritual teachers who began to teach me about other realms and the possibility of other realms. And so that was the beginning of my curiosity into the spiritual realm. And as you know, that was my first study, was metaphysics, which is quantum, which is, Kabbalah, but it was also Gnostic and Coptic Christianity. It was Vedanta, Hindu philosophy, Buddhism, and the Tao. that was all spurred from that. That curiosity came from there. And my teachers were, the Tao is a completely different philosophy, because what people don't know about the Tao is that the Tao and Confucianism was running at the same time in China. They were competitive. And Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching, refused to write anything down. Confucius wrote everything down and wanted it to become the philosophy of China. And the Tao Te Ching was not written. So when Lao Tzu had so many followers, and to go from province to province in China at that time, you had to go through borders. And there was always guards on the borders. And they arranged it so that his followers were always at the borders. So they locked him up. His followers locked him up.
Right.
And refused to let him out until he wrote stuff down. And at every border he passed through, they got him to write down some more. Until eventually they got the Tao Te Ching.
So was if I'm hearing you right, your curiosity was spiked, well, it reignited at this time then?
So it started there, and then the next place of curiosity for me was at 10 years old. I walked into the living room, and I saw my mom crying. Now, based on what I've told you so far, you're not surprised my mom was crying, but I saw my mom crying. And, I'm their eldest son. I'm a, quote, little hero. Terrible message, but again. So I walk in and my mom's crying and she's wiping her tears away and she's pushing her glasses up. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she points at the TV and she says, "He's dead." Who? I look at the TV set. It's not a politician that I know. Doesn't play for Man City or Man United, so I don't know him. I've not seen him on Coronation Street, so I don't know who he is. And then I listen. And he says, "I have a dream that one day," and I froze and began to listen. And I became deeply, deeply curious about how this black Christian minister from a kid's point of view, on the other side of the world, was having such a profound impact on my poor Jewish mother, who's white, on this side of the world.
Right.
And I was like, I became deeply curious about who he was and how he could have this impact over all those miles, because you live in these cloistered realities when you're a kid, right? And suddenly it's something bigger. And so I asked my uncle, who was the smartest member of the family, who he was, and he taught me about his peaceful marches and talked to me about how he was following the path of Gandhi, and I learned about Gandhi through that. So that was the second ignition of the curiosity. The third came when I was about 15, I think. This is wonderful. There was a show called Tomorrow's World, and then out of that came a show called Connections with James Burke. Now, if some older people are listening to this who are American, you'll remember it from PBS because it ran on PBS. It was a British show, and this guy was amazing. He would show how this was connected to that. And when I say this connected to that, it's obscure things. So this pen is connected to this railway line, which is connected to quantum theory. I'm like, what? And so I would be engrossed. Right. I was absolutely engrossed. That man was, in my language, the godfather of my curiosity. He was the godfather of my curiosity, and I was able to track him down last year.
Wow.
He lives in France, and I interviewed him. And he's actually on one of my podcasts. I interviewed him. It was just pure heaven. And I told him, you're the godfather of my curiosity. And he was, I was a kid, right?
Dov, say his name
I'm
one
still
more time.
alive.
Say his name one more time so people listen to this.
James Burke. And the old shows were called Connections. You can still watch them on YouTube. But it was this wonderful in the 1970s showing these how the connections with things. And right now he's doing, I think it's for Gaia. He's doing another season in France. He was writing it when I called him, and he's in his 80s, late 80s.
Awesome. He definitely knows his why. Dov, this is so fascinating because the new question I literally had formed that I hadn't asked anyone before, you're already going right to it. And it seems to be something that not a lot of people talk about, but every time I see hints of it here and there, it doesn't surprise me. Mm-hmm. So from your perspective, and your understanding, your curiosity, and your experiences, what more is there? than this material existence.
Well,
What do you believe?
I
Or
think
no?
that, yeah, so from my point of view, the question, in my perspective, is fractured because it's when it says, what more is there than this? That's like picking up a grain of sand on a beach and saying, what more is there than this? This is very small.
Yes.
This is a fraction, a fraction of a fractal of something. So, as you know, I studied also along with the religious philosophies, quantum physics, psychology, neurosciences. Then I'm a polymath. Again, thanks to James Burke. However, when I went off and studied all those religions, I was always looking for. I'm a pattern guy, right? I'm looking for what's the patterns to recognize, and there was patterns. I could see them, but a lot of the spiritual stuff for me was annoying because people couldn't get their shit together, right? They couldn't hold a job. They couldn't hold a relationship, right? They could tell me which way my aura was spinning, but they couldn't tell me, they couldn't make a quid, and they couldn't ever hold down a relationship. So I studied psychology. I wanted to understand them. I studied Jungian psychology, and I started to understand them. But then I found they wanted to moan and complain and whine and blame somebody. I was like, well, this is bull. I'm not interested in this. So I started studying what was then the psychology of excellence, which today is called leadership, and found a lot of empty souls.
Right.
Right. So I was like, oh, there's something missing here. So on this end of the spectrum, the spiritual, the very rich souls, but poor inside of the physical world.
Right.
And on the other side, a lot of financial excellence, but soulfully missing. What is the point here? What's going on? And that's the beginning of the journey to understanding and really creating my project, which was to source the emotional source code of human beings, of nations, and of organizations, which is what I do today. However, what it came down to was these patterns were, there's something greater. What is it? Whether you're speaking a Jungian level of consciousness, this nebulous thing we can't grab, because how does consciousness arise? Consciousness, which is a non-physical, arise from a physical matter, because your brain is a lump of meat, and out of that comes consciousness. So how does something non-tangible come from a tangible thing? So that was at a psychology level. At a quantum level, that we know about fields of energy, and not woo-woo energy, but actual resonance fields. Those fields are created, and how are those fields created? And those fields are, again, non-physical. And at a spiritual level, this relationship to something other than ourselves. Okay. For me, people ask me all the time, did you choose one of those religions? I was born Jewish, but did you follow one of them? No, absolutely not. I'm completely in favor of you having a religion. I'm completely against me having one. Because in truth, for me, I'll tell you exactly what my religion is. It's over my shoulder. My religion is curiosity.
Right.
That's my religion. Yep. Because, and I would say that the foundation of my religion, which is curiosity, is discernment. Because if I'm curious without discernment, then I'll believe anything. I've gone from curious to naive.
Right.
And although there's value in naivete, which is different,
right,
which is that childlike openness,
right,
but I'm curious, but I want to have discernment. I want to look at that and examine that and look for the patterns in it and see what it's about and decide whether it's good for me, not whether it's good for you. Right? So there's no judgment. It's just like, does it work for me? No. Like, I don't care if you're gay. I'm just not interested in participating. Thank you. But, whatever it is. I don't care if you're a Catholic or you're a Satanist. It's got nothing to do with me. However, if it impacts me, I have to have discernment about that.
Right.
Right? So, okay, so it's supported by discernment. And through curiosity and discernment, I can always return to a place of love. I can see you for who you are beyond the facade of your identity.
Right.
I can see you as a creation of something other than us, other than our own being. So is there more? I don't know how there couldn't be. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's and again, this might pop a few corks, but for me, it's as arrogant as saying we're the only life in the universe, only intelligent life. Like, come on. There are millions and millions of galaxies, And then on top of that, there are suggested black holes in those galaxies that lead to other universes. It's infinite. And of course, we're the smartest thing in the universe. Oh yeah, you only have to look at Russia and Ukraine. You only have to look at the way we handle money or the way that we take care of this planet. We're so good. Of course, we are the most intelligent. And I think there's far more intelligent ones who go, you know what? Let's just leave those guys alone. Let's just not stick anything into the anthill because those guys are just going to make a mess of it. So let's leave them alone. They'll work it out. We'll come back in a couple of thousand years, see how they're doing.
Dov, we're going to get in this emotional source code in a minute, and I think this will probably lead into it. How did you, with this background, and we're getting a glimpse of it, how did you let go of judging and embrace love?
Well, first of all, I'm laughing because you don't get over judging. It's a human condition. Of course you judge. It's not about whether you judge. Stop trying, get over this being non-judgmental. It's nonsense. Your human survival depends upon your judgment. What's important is discernment about your judgment.
Good word.
Why am I judging this? Does it impact me? Does it impact my highest, truest set of maxims, not values, but maxims? If it does, okay, then I can re-examine that. But if it doesn't, what's it got to do with me? Like, that's ridiculous. So you're going to judge. It's programmed into your biological DNA for your survival. Deciding what to judge is a higher level of consciousness. I don't need to judge everything. Am I going to? Of course. Yeah, that's going to come up. But I can go, oh, well, what's that going to do with me? Nothing. So I move away from it. And the way I got to that, because that's your question, was I was with Parthasarya, who was my Vedanta teacher. He was the dean of the university, the Vedanta University in Bombay.
And expand on what is that again? Just for some
Vedanta is
context.
Hindu philosophy.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So brilliant man, wonderful man. And I'm go to meet with him, and I show up, and I'm in a pissy mood. And he says, "What's the matter?"
And how old were you now?
23.
Okay.
So 23, I'm studying Vedanta. And I'm like, I'm just in this bad mood. And he's like, well, what happened? And there's this, something had happened in the neighborhood of where I lived, and somebody had murdered somebody. And it had been a situation that I felt could have been managed so much better. Social services could have helped. It was, it was a mess. Sure. And I was angry and disgusted and disappointed in the system, right? And he asked me, well, how do you feel about the guy who did the murder? And I said, I can feel compassion for what, I don't know what would have pushed him to that point of view, but it's hard for me to understand that you would go to that place. Mm-hmm. And he said, okay. So, and at the end, our conversations were sometimes as long as 4 or 5 hours, and sometimes as short as 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. And on this one was a short one. And he said, I have a mantra for you. And I said, okay. Now, if you don't know what a mantra is, it's a statement that you repeat over and over and over. And you just let it echo in your brain. It's not an affirmation.
Right.
Oftentimes, it's a statement that will sort of irritate or, it will get things moving. And so he said, I have a mantra for you, and I don't want to talk to you about it. And I don't want you to talk to me about it. And next week we'll come back and we'll talk about it. I said, okay. And he said, here's the mantra. I said, all right. And he goes, the murderer lives in me. I'm like, what are you talking about? There's no murderer in me. Completely defensive. And he said, that's the end of our time. The murderer lives in me. So I walked around, because I was a very good student of his. I walked around going, the murderer lives in me. That's bullshit. The murderer lives in me. No, it doesn't. The murderer lives in me. All these judgments firing off in my head about this statement. And then by the time the week had gone by, I walked in and he said, how are you? And I said, I'm good. And he said, any thoughts? And I said, the murderer lives in me. And I began to look at what I was judging. This is what his lesson was. That I had murdered people's dreams. I had murdered people's hopes. Not on purpose, but I'd done it. I had murdered my own dreams. And I also took it to the physical and went, in the right situation under a set of circumstances that are beyond my imagining, is it possible that I could murder? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Did I eat any meat today? Yes, the murderer lives in me.
Mm.
Did I eat any vegetables today? Yes, the murderer lives in me. Because if you look at the research from the early 60s, and again, part of my bizarre polymathy, you can look at the research that shows that animals and plants feel. Back in those days, we thought animals didn't feel. We didn't even give anesthetic to dogs until the 1990s because we thought they didn't feel. And we think that plants don't feel, but it was demonstrated clearly is that if you put a very similar to, what's the right term, the real word for a lie detector? Oscillograph?
No, polygraph.
Polygraph. So that you wire up a plant like a polygraph,
Mm-hmm.
and you take another plant that is in the range of that plant, so the somatic field is there, and you move it off there, and you drop it into boiling water, the plant that's alive reacts.
It's also why I read the book by Robin Sharma, The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. They call it eating live food.
Right.
Which is plants.
Yeah.
Live food.
Yeah, but that's the point. Everything is alive. There is life force to it. And it's one of the things I actually do love about the Muslim faith and the Jewish faith is that there is a brocha. There is a blessing for every piece of food you eat.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be before you drink wine, you say Barei Peri Agofen. There's a long prayer, but that's the end of the prayer. And it's the gratitude for the grape, but it's not the grape. It's for the vine that grew the grape. It's for the person who harvested the grape. It's for the person who turned the grape into wine. It's this recognition of the ecology of something, this ecosystem that brings anything to part. So when you asked earlier, is there more? We come back to the same place. Well, like, hold on a second. I drive a vehicle. Okay, well, who am I going to thank? Am I going to thank Jaguar? Am I going to thank Tesla? Am I going to thank Ford? Who am I going to thank? Well, hold on a second. What about thanking that guy in India who got rubber from trees? Mm-hmm. What about the first guy to ever work out how to do that? Mm-hmm. What about the person who molds the plastic in a factory that goes inside of your dashboard? Yes, we can thank the designers and we can thank the owners. What about the person who works on the factory floor who is exhausted and tired and overworked and doesn't get paid enough? What about the person who did the artwork for the design? So it's like understanding this Mandelbrot set. Do you know what that is?
No. The
Mandelbrot set is a quantum understanding. So if you go look up Mandelbrot set.
Can you spell it out so that my translator will get it?
So MANDOLBROT. Probably not spelled right.
Close enough.
Because I can't spell.
All right.
Barely can spell my own name. But Mandelbrot set. And what it is that you've seen it. I know you've seen it.
Right.
Because we've all seen it. And you're looking at this pattern. And as you look into the pattern, it goes deeper, and you find one tiny piece of the pattern, you look into it, and as you look into that part of the pattern, it opens up again into the same pattern.
Right.
Over and over. That's a Mandelbrot set.
Okay.
We live in a Mandelbrot set. So everything is inside everything. It's like looking into a mirror that's in front of you with a mirror behind you. You can see these infinite reflections. So that's what it is. Everything is everything is everything is everything. So when you start looking at life from that position, you start understanding that, hold on, I'm not that different than you. And you're not that different than me. That maybe 10,000 mirrors back or maybe 2 mirrors back, the murderer lives in me. Right. It doesn't mean you're a murderer. Please understand that. That's not what you're saying. But what you do with that is you build compassion. What you build with that. So, a lot of talk about empathy. You and I talked about it in previous interviews. Empathy is incredibly important. Empathy without compassion, who cares?
Right. Compassion.
Right? You're not doing anything. Compassion is the action.
Yep.
Right? So you've got the empathy and the compassion. But the compassion can only come from true empathy. And the true empathy is not putting myself in your place. It's seeing you as me.
Right.
It's far deeper. The murderer lives in me. So I can have compassion for you. It's like, okay, I know you killed this person. Tell me how you got to that decision. Well, it wasn't a decision. It was in the moment. Okay, let's talk about the emotional source code that got you to that place. And then and every time, Robin, every time I do this, as you know, I do this with leaders, world leaders, business leaders, athletes, entertainers, entrepreneurs, whatever it is. Every time they go, oh my God, of course, that's exactly what it is. That's what's been driving the bus forever. But it's disguised. You can't see it. Fish cannot describe water. You're swimming in your own crap.
Right. Everything you've just shared is the undercurrent, which brings me to that. How did all this move into the emotional source code? What is it and how's it work?
Well, it all moved into it out of pure frustration because it was like, I don't know how to communicate what I see. Because people who are my friends and who are my clients will always say, how do you see this? I don't get it. And I couldn't answer it.
Seeing the code behind the matrix.
Yeah, that's what it was, right?
Yep.
And I couldn't answer the question because, as a very good friend of mine said, you have no clue what you're doing, do you? And I said, no. He goes, I know you're a master, but you don't know what you're doing. And I said, no. He goes, you have to work out what this is because otherwise it dies with you. And I'm like, and he goes, and I know what your life's purpose is, so that can't happen. I'm like, you're absolutely right.
What's your life's purpose? You said it. I want to hear it.
My life's purpose is to impact the lives of the people whose names I will never know and whose names I will never know. And they will never know my name, I'll never know theirs. So to have a positive impact on those people in fulfilling their life's purpose by understanding their emotional source code so they find out what it is that they want to heal the world of. Right? So I can't do that if it dies with me.
Right.
So this was the challenge. And so again, it's not something that's new to me. It's just something that's new in its formation or formulation. So for me, as I said, I've always been a polymath. I wanted to find a way to bring together quantum physics, metaphysics, psychology, neurosciences, all these different areas and more politics, etc. And you and I have talked about all these things separately in our own conversations off air. But I wanted to bring them together because for me, they all connected. Mm-hmm. I could always see the clear connection. It's not like, well, can I glue this to this? No. It's already infinitely connected. I just don't know how to show others how it is.
Right.
So I began to lay out the emotional source code. And one of the ways that started was back in the 80s, it was very popular to talk about change, right? Change management. That's what we called it.
Yep.
And people resisted change. And how do you do change management, right? And I realized what a bunch of crap that was because they were teaching people how to change, but it would stick about as well as a Post-it note would in a windstorm, right? It'd stick for a second and then it's gone, right? It's just gone. It's a terrible technology. So you can't change behavior. And people go, oh, so we should just give up? No. No, not at all. So what I began to understand was that all behavior is based on belief. You can't change a behavior without addressing the belief. Okay, so now we need to do belief strategies, right? Belief, and I, became a master trainer in neuro-linguistic programming because I figured that was going to be a great tool for getting inside belief systems, and it is. But it wasn't enough. So now I'm like, okay, hold on a second. So I know I can't change behavior unless I change belief. And now I've changed beliefs, but some of those behaviors are certainly coming up to the surface still. Maybe a bit distorted, but they're still coming up to, okay, what's going on? So there's a default position happening behind the change in belief. So there's like an embedded belief that is far deeper than me just changing beliefs. There's something happening as a knee-jerk reaction.
And what type of beliefs are you talking about?
Anything. So I'll give you an example. The person, I'm trying to think of a way to say this. Okay, what I mean by that without giving a person away. So this person was a very devout Catholic as a child. Okay? Very devout. Discovered that was not for them, didn't like the judgment, didn't like the idea of going to hell in a handbasket, etc., etc. Gave up Catholicism and actually became Buddhist, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, their version of a Buddhist. Okay, very cool. We're having a conversation. So now you've got behavioral change. I'm not going to church on Sunday. I am not telling you that you've got to accept the Lord. I'm not talking about the Trinity. I'm not doing any of that stuff. right? Don't celebrate Christmas in the way of any, that's a religion or a ritual, right? And so we're having a conversation, and this person then quote something Buddhist at me. Again, as you know, I'm a student of that. So quote something Buddhist at me, but I hear, you do know that wasn't Buddhism, right? And he goes, what do you mean? I go, you just threw a Buddhist shirt over a Catholic body. And he went, what do you mean? I go, and I quoted him some Catholic stuff, and he's like, oh my God, that shit's still in there. Right? And now, I'm not saying it is shit, of course, but that was his reaction to it.
Right.
So there's this undercurrent, knee-jerk reaction in these deeper beliefs.
Right.
So you can change the beliefs at level 1, level 2, but level 3, very difficult to change level 3 beliefs.
Right.
Right? So it's like, okay. And this is part of when people become in a lot of anxiety because they've changed the behavior, they've changed the belief, but there's something like, internal, there's a beliefs conflict going on inside of them. So you know about beliefs in conflict. When that happens, there's an inner turmoil. So I went, okay, what is going on here? Learned how to change the beliefs. Learned how to change the behaviors by changing the beliefs. And if I can change the beliefs, which I can, why is this other thing, this undercurrent coming in? And then I realized through this work that behavior is driven by beliefs, but beliefs are driven by identity. People will not do things that is in conflict with their identity.
Yep.
They will not, doesn't matter. They can be masterful at lying. They can, this better than 99.9% of people on the planet. They can be masterful at lying, but if you challenge their identity, they'll spill the truth. They'll spill the truth because it's like, oh, so, if this person has an identity that I'm brave and I'm courageous, right? And that's why I murdered these people because no one else would do it. And you go, well, so wasn't that an act of cowardice? It's an emotional response, right? So it's got all the fuel to it because you've challenged the identity. So now what we've got is we've got behaviors, beliefs, identity. Okay. Now I should mention this identity sits right in the middle, and it is the most difficult one of all because identity is how I survived. I'll come back to it. Below identity is the anatomy of meaning. And below anatomy of meaning is the emotional source code. So now let's run it the other way. The other way is this. Think of the metaphorical DNA. Your emotional source code is your emotional DNA. Right. That's what you got. You got it. You can't change your DNA. It is what it is. Will get you off in a murder case or get you convicted in a murder case. It's not, my DNA is not yours. Now, but is DNA fixed? We used to think it was. And we used to think that DNA was not only fixed, but it was primal. So the primacy of DNA, meaning DNA determines everything about you. It determines your physiology, how you behave, your psychology, all those things. But then we entered into the Human Genome Project to uncover, again, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent that's part of my areas, but it'll help you understand this. We looked at that. We were totally surprised that we were not that different than a field mouse. In fact, in the 90th percentile, similar to a field mouse. So we're really not that advanced. Let's think about that again at a DNA level. And so we go, okay, so if this is my DNA, does it determine everything? We thought we'd find the shy gene and all those things. And there was lots of talks of those kinds of things. But what came out of it was the realization that it's not the gene, it's the epigenetic effect on the gene. Now, what is epigenetics? Epigenetics is the way that a gene responds to its environment. It doesn't change the gene, it changes the way the gene responds. Quote, switching it on or off.
Right.
This is work that started in the late 60s, but never came to really fruition until mid 2000 to 2010 is when it started to come to surface really well. So what we started to learn was that the gene is going to respond to the environment. Now, what's the environment of a gene? Well, it's the cell. So we used to think the gene is the brain, right? The DNA is the brain of the cell. But if you take that out, the cell doesn't die. Hold on a second. If I take your brain out, I'm pretty sure you'll die. So why doesn't it die? If you break the membrane or you change the membrane, the DNA will die. Mm-hmm. So the membrane is the environment that holds the DNA, that holds that. So what is the, quote, liquid that goes into that environment? That liquid is a neuropolypeptide cascade created inside of your brain. Created in different parts of your brain, but certainly in the hypothalamus, which is the mood and appetite center, the amygdala, etc., parts of your brain. And that floods your body and your brain with these neuropolypeptides, floods them with them, that builds receptors on the cells for whatever is the most of. So if, let's say, this is a ridiculous number, but let's say you've got 1,000 receptors on your cell. It's not, it's millions. Mm-hmm. You have 1,000 receptors on your cell. And your brain keeps flooding anger from when you're a child, right? Mm-hmm. The receptors on the cells now start building receptors for anger because that's the one there's most of. That receptor then takes in the anger neurochemical cascade, puts it inside of the cell, and the DNA responds to anger. So emotion is a neurochemical. And the neurochemical changes the cell. Now, that's cells. Now let's go back to emotional source code. Your emotional source code is your emotional source code. It's fixed, like your DNA. But does it turn on or off? That's determined by the environment. The environment gives you your anatomy of meaning.
Right.
So it says, oh, trust this person because I could trust them when I was a kid. They're like, and this is what the mind uses, like. This is like that. Right. It's not true. It's just this is like that. And so I say to people, here's a simple example. I want you right now, as you're listening, as you're watching this, think about somebody who was at school, when you were at school, who was a dick. Mm-hmm. Maybe they were a dick to you, or maybe they were just a dick generally. Maybe there was a bully to you. Whoever it is, I want you to think of that person. Have you got one? Robin?
Yep.
Okay. What was the person's first name? Just first name.
Tim.
There is an automatic reaction inside of you, tell me if I'm wrong, that when you meet a Tim, there's a micro flash of a resistance or something like there's an anatomy of meaning of this 3-letter name that says, oh, can I trust this Tim? It's automatic. Again, we talked about judgment. It's automatic. It's not because you're a horrible person.
Right.
It's inside your anatomy of meaning. Tims are dicks.
Right.
Okay. Now you, having discernment and being an evolved human being, go, is that true? Let's have a look. No, this is a great Tim. But that instant reaction comes from your anatomy of meaning.
Right.
So you've decided how to survive in the world by creating these quick classifications inside of your anatomy of meaning.
Right.
You then build an identity in order to survive in the world. Now, human beings desperately need to belong. That is in our DNA. It's at every possible level. It's all the way back to cavemen, because if we didn't have a tribe, we died. It's very simple.
Yep.
So we need a tribe. Human beings need to belong. However, and this is, underline this please if you're taking notes, we trade belonging for fitting in. Vastly different. Vastly different. As you know, I spoke at the UN back in 2015, and I spoke there with my cohort who was Tony McAleer. Tony McAleer wrote a book called The Cure for Hate. Tony is an ex-neo-Nazi. Mm-hmm. He was the head of war, white Aryan race. We were speaking about de-radicalizing the far right. Mm-hmm. Because Tony had become that white Aryan guy as a result of his emotional source code, of his anatomy of meaning, and he needed a place to belong. Mm-hmm. But he traded that for a place he would fit in.
Right.
So he ended up in a neo-Nazi group because he wanted to feel loved. He wanted to feel like he belonged. He wanted to. He's incredibly intelligent. He wanted a place where his intelligence would be valued, and he wanted a place where he would have a voice. He got all that in that movement, so he took on the beliefs
Right.
to fulfill the identity that created the behaviors.
Right.
That's emotional source code.
Right.
That's how it works for all of us. So if you want to change the behavior, you have to change the belief. If you want to change the belief, you've got to address the identity. But addressing the identity is difficult because this is how I survive based on my anatomy of meaning.
Right.
And I just got the emotional source code of who I am. I can't change that, but you can change the anatomy of meaning. So no longer does Tim always be a dick, although it might be the knee jerk. Tim might be Tim might be a lovely guy. And then as a result, I can look at my identity differently. As a result, I can look at the beliefs that support that identity. And as a result, I can realize that I'm doing behaviors that support the beliefs that supported the old identity. And so when I work with somebody, that's where we're going. The one-on-one work, that's where we're going. And it's terrifying for some people because you're asking me to question my identity. Don't we call it an identity crisis? I call it an identity breakthrough. If you're going through an identity crisis right now as you listen to this, I want you to think of it this way. If you're a religious person, I want you to think, this is my gift from God. This identity crisis is to show me I've been living as somebody I'm not. And that in and of itself can be a terrifying idea. It doesn't mean you're going to give up everything about who you were, but there is elements of who you are that are completely contradictory to who you truly are. And my job in our work is to bring home what we call the disenfranchised parts of yourself that you gave up in order to fit in. And when you reclaim them, you find the place you belong so you can serve in the world and make a greater difference.
Jeez, just leaves you speechless.
Sorry, mate.
No, it really does. When people bring you on to identify their emotional source code, what do they hope to get out of this?
Well, usually if it's an individual, they've reached the place where they've gone, I have it all. I'm married, I have a good partner, I've got good kids, they're doing well, I've made a lot of money, I've bought a house here and I bought a yacht there. Why is something still missing? Why do I have this gnawing knowing that something's missing? Mm-hmm. Like there's a memo I didn't get, there's something going on and I don't know what it is.
Right.
And they're thinking about doing behaviors that are inconsistent with who they are. Now that's actually their soul challenging them to say, you're not this identity. So you start doing things that are destructive to the identity. And then what happens to that is there's an egoic response, which is to overcompensate, to come back even harder on that side. Doesn't work. But it's that point of going, this isn't work, there's something missing. When they bring me in to do it with a company, it's like, okay, we make a lot of money, we do very well, but we don't have loyalty. We can't build that bond with our people or with our customers in the way that we want it, so that people are bound to us, emotionally connected. We try to do all this smart, intelligent, logical stuff. It doesn't work. Human beings are emotional first, not second, first. We rationalize our emotions. We tell rational lies about our emotions. We're emotional first. So in a company, we want to go to what is the emotional source code of that organization so people can bond to it. But you can break it down, as I said, even with nations. As you know, you and I talked about doing it with America or Britain.
Right. And, for those listening, if you want a good first start on getting an example of one of these emotional source codes, Dov does a fantastic job with Vladimir Putin. And all you have to do to get that is subscribe to his newsletter and you get it. I did it because I was about to give a talk on the geopolitical challenges of Ukraine and Russia. And I worked against Russia my entire career in the FBI. And I found that emotional source code of Putin that you did profound. It was spot on. I've used it and it's a great example. So for those listening, go ahead and subscribe to that newsletter and get that so you can understand how to dive deeper. And Dov, as we start closing this up, what would you recommend people do as a first thing to start this journey to discover their own emotional source code?
Well, thank you, Robin. I really appreciate that. First of all, I would do what you just said. Go to dovbaron.com, DOVBARON.com, and just download that. It comes up as a pop-up in 10 seconds, and you can download that just so you get a grasp of it. And by the way, I would also encourage you to do this. I would really encourage you to do this. listen back to this show, because you were probably doing something. That's what most people are doing during podcasts. Listen back and take some notes, because I guarantee you missed stuff. And the reason that is because I said things that challenged your identity. I know that. I know that. And what happens is when you challenge the identity, the ego goes, "Oh, that's interesting. Let's get rid of it." It throws it behind your head. Let's get rid of it. I don't know what you're talking about. Right? So you need to listen to it a couple of times and take some notes on it and ask yourself those deeper questions. So that's where you can start. However, on a personal level, start by asking the difficult questions. What do I believe? Okay, I believe this. Why?
Right.
Why? Why do I believe that? So I told you the story of a guy who came in who was in one of the workshops we were doing, and I said, "Put your hands up if you're religious." And he put his hand up, and I said, "What religion are you?" And he said, "I'm a Catholic." And I said, "Why?" And he's like, "Are you saying I shouldn't be?" And I said, "Absolutely not. I'm actually here to support you in your faith, not pull you away from it." And he goes, "Well, I don't understand the question." I said, "Why are you a Catholic?" He goes, "Well, I go to church. I believe in Jesus. I believe in the Trinity. I go to church. My mom was Catholic. My father's Catholic, blah, blah, blah." And I said, "Oh, so you're Catholic because you fell out of a Catholic vagina? Or a sperm donor who was Catholic?" And he goes, "No, that's ridiculous." Now he's mad at me now, right?
Right.
And I said, "I'm just asking you to question it. I'm not saying you're not a Catholic. I'm not saying you shouldn't be one. I'm asking you to question it." He was pretty pissed. I didn't see him for about 2 months, and I'm walking down Robson Street, one of the main shopping streets in Vancouver, and I see him coming towards me, and I'm thinking, "Ooh, this could be a bit iffy."
Right.
And he's coming towards me, but instead of me being upset, instead of him being upset, he's happy. And he gives me a big hug, and he goes, "Dov, I'm so glad to see you." And I said, "Oh, I'm surprised. It didn't go so well last time." And he goes, No. I want to thank you." And I said, "Why?" He goes, "Because now I'm a Catholic." He goes, "I get it now." He goes, "I thought you were trying to talk me on religion, but I understand now you were actually taking me deeper into it." Question what it is you believe. Ask yourself, why do I believe that? And whatever you get as an answer, why do I believe that? And whatever you get as an answer, why do I believe that? Start there. If you're willing to be curious, not judgmental,
Right.
curious about the things you believe, and then you apply discernment, which is, okay, well, I've got to that answer, but does that make any sense for me? Suddenly things get deeper. Your life gets deeper. Your love gets deeper. If you're in a relationship and I say, "Why?" You say, "Because I love my wife." Not enough, mate. Not enough. Why do you love your wife?
Right.
Because of this. Well, she's a good woman. Okay. Why do you love her? Because she's a good woman. Why do like one of the reasons I love my wife is she challenges the shit out of me.
Right.
Right? That she's not only on my cheering squad, she's on my boot me in the ass squad. Right? So it's like, take it deeper. As you start to do that, you start to explore yourself. Because here's the thing, and I want to just say this before we finish. You will never be a great leader without deep self-knowledge. And deep self-knowledge will never be acquired on your own.
Yep.
A fish cannot describe water. You're swimming in your own shit. You need someone else who can help you to see that and guide you. It doesn't have to be me, but it certainly can't be your best mate who is biased. It can't be your missus or your husband who is biased. It can't be your kids who is biased. It needs to be somebody external of you, objective, and preferably who you pay, because then you're invested in going the whole journey. That is my recommendation.
Perfect. Dov, I never know what I'm going to get. It's like a box of chocolates.
Life with Dov is a box of chocolate.
It was awesome. Thank you so much for the journey, sharing that journey with me and the audience today. And it was everything I was hoping for and more. And I hope everyone take Dov's advice. Listen to this episode multiple times. So do that, dive in, and thanks again, Dov.
Thank you, Robin. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Always is a pleasure and honor talking to you. And thank you for taking me in directions that don't normally happen in a podcast. I want to just say to everybody, listen multiple times, but you know what? I keep saying this, it's so important. Rate, review, and subscribe to the show. This is a one-way system we're sharing with you. Robin doesn't know. I know how much work he puts into this. Let him know you appreciate it. Tell him what you got out of the show. Not just mine, any of the episodes. Because trust comes from reciprocal vulnerability. The willingness to share. Be willing to do that. I appreciate you. Thank you, Robin. It's always a pleasure, my friends. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.
Stay curious. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Forged by Trust. If you enjoyed the show, took away a few new tools, I hope you'll click like and leave a great review of the show to show your support. If you're interested in more information about how I can help to forge your own trust-building communication and interpersonal strategies for yourself or your organization, please visit my website at www.peopleformula.com. I'm looking forward to sharing my next Forged by Trust episode with you next week when we chat with my good friend Annie Lieb and soul-centered breath framework for creating the life you want to lead.